Think about it. And don't just sit in a document that people can't figure out what to do with. Make this usable. Use examples of it. Change management now for the people, as people are constantly changing, it's the same idea. If you can stay ahead of things in order to say, I have a way of knowing when people are changing. I have a way of knowing what it means when people change in terms of policy. And I have a way of knowing which data needs to be affected in which way. You're done.
Welcome to Pioneers, the show where we explore the intersection between humanity and AI. I'm your host, Ankur Patel. Over the last 10 years, I've built 3 AI startups, written 2 books about the subject, and I run a weekly AI newsletter. I also regularly teach and speak about the topic at conferences. This technology has grown faster than I think any of us could have imagined, and it's making us ask really important questions, such as how ethical is AI? What will this technology look like in a few years, let alone a few months? And most importantly, does it have the power to truly change the world? And what does it mean for you? On this show, I'll be interviewing the founders, operators, and pioneers that are introducing AI into their companies and industries. We'll be asking them the really heavy-hitting questions that make them dig deep into the core of what we do. And without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ankur Patel, and today my guest is David Aaronson, who's a product marketing principal at Velotix. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Ankur.
One of the common things that we hear enterprises talk about is data readiness. Do they have sufficiently enough data, and is the data clean and ready enough to actually do generative AI or agentic AI? What is your answer to this common question that we get from enterprises?
Readiness is not even half the battle. It's pretty much all the battle. Everything else is just like last mile stuff, or tends to be. The goal is going to be accessibility and usability. So really anything you can do to kind of define what that's going to mean from a data governance angle, or what that's going to look like from a business angle in terms of actual like workflows. How long would it take to run this process through? And if we had to do this at like 10 times speed because technology in a week from now allows for that, that could really be the scenario. You want to be prepared for tomorrow instead of catching up. Anything else is you're going to find a competitor who can go faster than you, really.
When it comes to data readiness, should enterprises hold off on doing anything with generative AI and large language models, for example, until they have their data in a pristine state? Or are there ways to do both, which is prepare some data that they need for a given use case, start experimenting with AI while they also make major strides maybe on the bigger data backlog that they have to work through?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just because a business is a mature business doesn't mean their data side is a mature data side. And depending on some of the just how the data architecture and infrastructure got built up over time. So you might be very ahead of the game in that you've amassed a lot of data, you got a lot of processes around leveraging your data. Or you might be somewhere a little bit further behind, or somewhere a little bit newer. So you've kind of like built up a Snowflake and a Databricks and but in any event, that data needs to be consumable. So whatever we're going to be doing with that data needs to be prepared now in terms of accessibility. We talked about readiness, right? So if you can have those definitions already ready to go, your data can be in place. I think that's like part one. But also like part two is going to be about having some sort of technology framework in place. Now, to your point, so do I need to wait till everything's in a pristine condition, right? Probably if you're speaking to your internal teams, like what can we build, what can we design, talk to vendors, like what can we offer, right? It's like, can I ever get to that place? And what am I going to do in the meantime? So I think that just to direct go to your question, it has to do with maturity, and there's no reason to wait till you're more mature to do something, or you're going to have to, like teenagers, right? They grow and like one arm's a little bit longer. No, like, the arms are long and lanky and like the legs look like this, right? So you need to be able to find a certain equilibrium with the usability of your data, right? You've got a bunch of data scientists, you got data analysts, you got everyone ready to go to like extract, you got business intelligence systems, you've got pipelines and ETL, everything's like, firing, but then that data gets stuck and then no one gets to it. So the more you can try to, keep an equilibrium between what kind of data we're trying to get out the door and how we're preparing it from the get-go, and the more you can do to align your strategy, as opposed to like having a Databricks here and a Snowflake there and an on-prem, the more you can do to allow for this data sprawl to continue to develop naturally the way that things are evolving today. Right? People don't buy tools just to make things complicated, right? It's to solve really business processes. That's the whole purpose of it. So the more that you can do to align these systems will allow you to kind of be more in balance so that your needs are going to be met with, okay, well then this is what we're going to have for you and this is the plan we're going to have. And if I see a certain trend with the needs of the data, I can now develop a new strategy and go faster. And I think actually the speed of being able to grow in those different increments through your maturity stages, like, are my permissions clear? Do they even make sense? Do I even know which data exists where, and is it classified properly so that I can start even understanding like who might have permissions to what, right? So the more you build up your picture, the faster you can go with your data. Because at the end of the day, you're not going to release data that you can't, that you can't justify, that you haven't, really run down the lineage, So you're going to have to do this work on it anyways. But just going to be a matter of prioritizing what your business's needs are and just growing together, I think.
It's really critical to know what data is stored where, who has access to it. So it's easy to go in and manage that for the different use cases you might need that data for. And I think it's never like a destination that you quite reach, right? But if you can go and triangulate closer to what the ideal optimal state should be, that's a good starting point. But at the same time, I don't think you can't wait forever for that data to get in order. So if you have specific needs of the business, you can kind of narrowly scope on what data do you have, how do you prepare it to move a particular use case forward. Because otherwise, you may try to strive for data perfection, and you might waste years trying to get that in place, which is not effort that's wasted, but at the same time, you're slowing down the cycles in learning some of the latest tooling around AI and where it could be helpful. So I think there needs to be a healthy balance between getting the data in order and then also learning and experimenting and then finding value from some of the AI tooling that's out in the market today.
Yeah, yeah, that totally makes sense.
I'm curious when it comes to data, and we could talk about like the broader market backdrop because I think you have this view around there's like an AI arms race underway, right? So you do have to build to be competitive, and the people that are experimenting and learning and building are going to have a leg up. But one argument around data is that these foundation model companies like an OpenAI or Anthropic, they're doing the hard work of preparing and curating tremendous amounts of data, right? Data is the lifeblood and as well as compute. So they use the latest algos, they assemble massive amounts of compute, like you look at what Elon's doing with Grok, and then they assemble high quality data sets, massive amounts, more the better. Including now, there's this push to get video data transcribed and used, which Google has a huge advantage in given they have YouTube. But basically, this data preparation and curation foundation model companies are doing, which the argument is that more of the knowledge is then stored within the weights of the models themselves. And so when you actually need to take like AI models and then use them, you don't need a whole lot of data to get those, but to get value from those models. Yes, you need to bring your maybe business context to the prompt of the LLM calls that you make, but you need less data because you're not building the model. You're basically consuming the model via inference. So I'm curious what your take on that view is, because that's a common push or arc that we see from businesses arguing you need less data now than you did, let's say, 5 years ago.
Very good point. I think there's, on the one hand, it's obviously become true. The power of these models is that you can do more with less. On the other hand, we know these statistics. The expectation is there's going to be 3 times the amount of data. And over the next 3 years, we're going to have more data developed, just created and generated over the next 3 years than has ever been created before in history of mankind. So, like, yes, less is great, but it's just more things that can all be done each individually, possibly with less. So while the use case might be nice, that we can leverage more with less, it doesn't mean that as the business we're gonna be able to capture it that way. So I think it's important to think of it big picture of what am I enabling my business to accomplish? What infrastructure can I develop to make sure that that's possible? And how do I put my business in the position to grow as technology does? Because if I'm always playing a reactive game to it, then it's all it takes is one, like we talked about the arms race. All it takes is one competitor who's ahead of the game. So I think cybersecurity, right? Cybersecurity, when you try to explain ROI, it's often very like, well, it has to do with insurance basically. And yes, there's a competitive nature to it, but you have to kind of like build that use case out and kind of explain that business case. And it can be a little bit fuzzy. And sometimes someone just needs to like, slam their fist on the table and say like, I don't understand why we need this. And so I'll be like, because I said so, right? Like, so that's sometimes how cybersecurity does go down, and just has to be that way. But I think data security is a very different world, because the definitions of prepared data is something that the business has been. I mean, business has been working on this for years. Data governance, I think, is a very is as an industry, is extremely mature compared to like where things might have been a few years back. So I think their understanding of how to define the ROI of making their data accessible, whether it's a lot of small packages of data sets, the right, or pinpointing the right data sets. And here's the kicker, right? Doesn't matter how big or small your data set is, if it's built on the wrong data, the whole thing
Hmm.
is not just fundamentally flawed. The whole picture of data and trust in data is gone, and then we're in a big problem. So regulators have been talking about this for a long time. Things are speeding up. We see in APAC, a big push to take really like far, like the emerging markets, like, oh, maybe in a few years, something. No, they're like trying to jump people ahead because they understand there's no choice. The future is now. And if that market is getting, Europe is getting it, America, like the United States, we're seeing in Canada, we're seeing, the actions being taken. So I think the ROI is just about looking at the business and saying, what is the expected need from data? And what happens if your governance isn't solid first? Or even if it's not solid, but like, what if your capabilities to draw on that data is limited by this and that? So if you can define your limitations and go, and you can, I think data governance, the people I speak to are amazing at this. They'll sit down and they'll try to sit down with, the business side and understand, what are you not able to do that you're trying to do, right? Because we keep getting these emails, these things keep coming up. But then the day, I don't want to deal with the one email. I want to get ahead of this,
Hmm.
right? So it does take, I think, a really human approach to the data to understand who is going to ultimately be responsible to make this thing work for us, and how do we put them in the best position to succeed, and how do we, because there's a lot of different parts of the business that go into this data prep, right? There's IT, there's data side, there's business side, and different organizations, how they're developed, and kind of how their architecture is set up, the history of their data, the history of the people who work there, and how these kinds of roles developed, right? Just, you can have someone whose title is data governance, and they're like a senior data governance, or the VP data governance, but it's really someone else over in data engineering, right? Like, you
Yeah.
can totally have this, and that's fine. As long as we can get people aligned on the need, we can make magic happen. And I think, and we talked a lot about the need and kind of like the approach to it, but I think, like, from the technology side, we are there in terms of being able to say, let's scale this thing. Let's figure out how we can put you in position to succeed. But you first need to come up with a definition of success.
Yeah.
So, as opposed to saying, yes, I'm going to have all this data, it's going to be amazing, it's going to be wonderful, like, make a clear business case. These are the things that we're going to need to have available to us as technology rises. And this is how we're going to get ahead of it. And it's going to give us a certain amount of potential for what we see today. And this is how we justify within the business. And that's like not easy, but you can do this, and people are doing it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, David. I mean, I think if we just come up with simple examples like personalized email, right? It's a use case that's very common with AI startups and agentic AI because outbound is a need for all organizations. They still do it, and I think what they're like. You could argue that you don't need a whole lot of data, but the data that you use needs to be very clean. So if you're targeting X person at Y company, you need good descriptions of the person and the company from their LinkedIn or from business graph or social graph that you have, because that's supplied as context to the LLM to then generate the right type of email copy. And you may also want to feed in successful campaigns and successful copy you've used previously, and that becomes critical. So how do you feed in, again, not a whole lot of data, but the data has to be very high quality for you to get really good results. Otherwise, if you have outdated social graphs or business graphs or have good copy examples of what's worked in the past, there's no way you could prompt an LLM to do even a simple use case like email outbound.
Yeah, and I'll give you another use case. I think they'll really drive this forward, because we're talking about the data side. There's a whole nother element here, which is the people side. Let's say we understand our data for a second, right? But we did everything we needed. We had cataloging, whatever, classifications. We did it all, right? We covered structure, we covered unstructured, everything. It's all covered. We know what it all is, right? Now, who's asking for this, and what are they going to do with it, and what are our policies around this? So where the sales team might see a great opportunity in getting access to certain data and turning it into, like you said, certain kinds of emails, certain kinds of campaigns that they think is like, okay, now we can quickly turn this idea into an actual, action that we're going to do for this quarter, right? So that's the idea. But who are they to look at your emails? Right? Just because it's a great idea doesn't mean that the data doesn't represent actual human beings. And I think people like to swing into the world of ethics here, but even before ethics, like, it's not your data. And I think when you fundamentally understand that data is something that is, and data sovereignty rules is a massive extension of this. Look how like guarded China, Germany are about data not even leaving, and what kind of governance or the pipelines of what happens with data, even if it's like access in this way and the other way. So they're picking up really quick that like whatever is like powerful in terms of GDP for economics, data power is also really, really big. And the more you're letting it slip into everyone else, you're losing something. So the people and the data are two things to match. And if you can't really match it, then here's that use case I was going to mention is people changing roles. Like anyone who's involved with like identity access management is like, yeah, that situation, right? It's pretty insane, and if you're a business that's making a lot of data, you probably have a lot of people coming in and out, and you probably have contractors and whatever. And if you're in healthcare, whatever kind of partners you have, and so on and so forth. So knowing your data, yes, absolutely, figure that out, and you can. It's totally doable. The projects involved with it are not like something that is just impossible to set up and years and years and years. It doesn't have to be that way. It really doesn't, and you don't need to bring in like millions of dollars on a, necessarily on the partner to make it all work, or else, right? You should do it professionally, and you should do it the way you need to do it, however you need to do it. You can't give the same advice to two companies in that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, as your people move and change, you need to be able to measure that and understand that and be able to have your policies still reign supreme, even as everything around it is changing. The data is changing, the people are changing, the use cases are changing, how they're using data is changing. But if you can be nimble with policies that can make sense in different contexts, and that's where we talk about, like in Velotics, what is a policy? So specifically for access, what is it? Well, I don't know necessarily what it is, right? Because it can mean different things to me. Is it something that's written down? Is it, some sort of philosophical system? Is it a series of things that we messed up in the past and we just know to look out for those things? And we have a checklist and somebody's always asking that question on an email chain, right? Like, is that a policy? Or is a policy something that is clear about what attributes about a user tell us their needs and therefore what data access eligibilities they should have? So when you can kind of put all those together and you've got your data, you're actually in a really good position to make much better decisions much faster, and forget the decisions, just evaluating the criteria of the decision is just in front of you. And that's, I think, something we were talking about before this podcast, Ankur. We were talking about how like change management, it's not what it was, it's not necessarily what it once was. In some ways, it's far, as the business gets more complex, as all the data rolls and everything around data gets more complex, so complexity rises. But at the same time, as long as you can have a good solid system to track those considerations of change, whether it's people, whether it's regulations, whether it's departments, whether it's whatever it is, the better you are going to be able to lay out a plan and say, this is how we're going to make a change, and this is how we're going to succeed in doing it. This is how we're going to invest. This is what we're going to have to change, and this is how we're going to track it. You can do that today with generative AI, like we were never able to do before. And that gives you a chance now to actually move faster. And data governance is one example of this. But as we like zoom out to the world of data in general, it think about it. Like, think about all the people involved, and then use AI to build these internal documentation of how we're going to approach these things. Test it, ask people questions, and don't just sit in a document that people can't figure out what to do with. Make this usable. Use examples of it. Change management now for the people, as people are constantly changing, it's the same idea. If you can stay ahead of things in order to say, I have a way of knowing when people are changing. I have a way of knowing what it means when people change in terms of policy. And I have a way of knowing which data needs to be affected in which way. You're done.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when you think about governance, it's actually having material financial impact. So part of it is internal data governance, which is like who should have access to what, especially if the roles were changing. And that's really important to get right. There's a even higher barrier when you think about data governance from like working with vendors or using third-party software, where you might want to do a POC quickly to evaluate. You basically have an RFP process with several vendors, several startups. Let's say you have to redact that data. How do you get that data? First, the access established, redact it, and then find a secure, safe manner to share that data for the proof of concept. That becomes hard in itself. And we have worked with enterprises where it takes months to provision very small redacted data sets. And it's because their data governance isn't set up properly to go and very quickly identify which data sets matter and then to basically scrub it or redact it and then get that clarity from compliance that this is okay to share, and then you're able to share, right? So it ends up, what it does is it kind of clogs the arteries of the organization around moving data to learn and experiment and test different vendors. And so you have this like calcified way of operating, becomes really hard. It slows down the gains and experimentation within the org, but then also working with external parties. And I think the data governance piece, if you do invest in it, if you do get that right, then all of a sudden the data can flow in a secure, safe manner, both internally in the organization and then also externally, with vendors and different LLMs that you might want to use. Hey there, very quickly. We just released a new agentic AI platform that makes it possible to automate very complex knowledge work. Our platform makes it far easier to set up multi-agent systems that allow you to coordinate work across AI agents, human supervisors, and third-party systems. This is the future of agentic AI, helping people get work done more quickly, adding more efficiency and productivity and better customer experiences. So if you're interested in agentic AI and what it could do for your organization, please book time with our team today.
Yeah, and I think that word calcify is spot on because it's more than just like I was going to say physical data, right? But it's more than just like the access to the data. It's also just how we as people in an organization think about data, right? Because if we're fundamentally used to things just taking a long time and every kind of request is going to have all kinds of considerations please don't come to me with all these new ideas, because any new idea you're going to come to me with is going to have a whole list of issues that I'm now going to have to figure out how to make this work. So we're actually, like, from a cultural perspective, it's going to keep us from even having the ideas in the first place. We're going to have to push back on, right? I mean, imagine anytime, and I'm sure this is super relatable to anybody watching this, right? Anytime, maybe it's at home, maybe it's at work, maybe it's like your kid, right? Kid comes to them and says like, I want to do this thing, I want to bake a cake, right? Well, do we have flour? Well, do we do it, right? And it's like, well, I want to make the cake now, right? So like at some point in the business, when you have these kinds of initiatives flowing around and people just being told like, hold up, slow down, slow down, slow down, slow down. Okay, I get it. You want me to slow down. We're not going to be able to hit on initiatives because we never actually had the initiative in the first place because we didn't have a culture to promote it because we don't know how to do it. So I think it's more than just technically making certain changes so that you like have a certain capability, right? We're not talking about sales and marketing just for the sake of like, how does something become valuable, right? It's not just a value. It's if we can fundamentally change how we approach data, we will have better ideas that we can execute on and actually like get to better places. And I have an example of something that like, so for communications compliance, okay, when it comes to FinServ for sure, right? Anything in BFSI these days with SEC, FINRA, and then and in Europe with GDPR, this is a very serious issue and regulators are on it, right? And internal risk and internal audit, like they're on it, compliance is on it. So one of the ways that they have, one of the tools in their new tools in their arsenal to recognize inside their own communications data, let me use some AI to figure out what's an illegal communication, what's something I'm not allowed to say, and we caught it, and now we're got ahead of it, right? So the businesses, not the business, I should say, but the compliance side of the businesses, they're very focused on this. This is extremely important. It can make or break their business. If they can't get under these data rules, they can end up being locked out of business and markets for a long time. This has happened as consequence for data retention, actually, right? Like this has happened and it will continue to happen. So what do? So they're going to use AI to train models on how to find it, and they're going to go down to regulators and say, look, this is what we're doing and we're working really hard. All that in order for that to happen, you need to have your data sets be able to be trained on. So like you said, you now need to take conversations that are examples of bad conversations, illegal conversations, and maybe specific kinds so that you can make sure it's trained to find those things in the future. But if you can't even get access to those communications because the communications data, then how do you build that model? And that's something that you wouldn't necessarily know to look out for until you're sitting there in front of a project and you're building out your own RFP so you could accomplish this. And you're all of a sudden looking at vendors who are going, "You're not ready." Or, "What do you mean I'm not ready? I did everything I needed to do." And the answer is no, because you did everything you needed to do, but data needs more than that. I really think it's a collaborative effort these days, and that's happening. I think it's really cool just to watch these conversations in the market. It's true, there's a lot of crossover, like we talked about, but that crossover is happening. It's not siloed. I mean, in some places it is because that's just how it is. Some places, but these conversations are happening. Change is happening, and we're seeing a lot of very, very strong outcomes from it, where people are able to now upscale their, in this example, communication surveillance because they have safe data sets, so they have confirmed within their policies. And when they want to go and test new things backwards and forwards, they can do that nimbly because they've allowed for it. Because if you have to kind of switch over to just synthetic data, you're going to miss on like the real meat of what people say that is wrong. They're creative. People are creative when they know they're not allowed to talk. They do something naturally. Their brains do. The AI is not going to do that without the examples of it. So you can't just synthetically do it.
Yeah.
The data is going to be gold.
Maybe let's switch gears a little bit and speak to the AI arms race that you've mentioned before, because I think, when you think about enterprise and adoption of AI, maybe adoption is the wrong word. Their eagerness to learn and understand AI, I think, is there, right? There is that sense of, hey, like this is like a big inflection point. I don't want to be left out. I want to learn. When it comes to maybe using, adopting, gaining value from it, I mean, the jury's still out. I think that's going to take some time. But what does AI arms race mean, especially in the context of global competition here?
I mean, we said that data is gold, right? So if you end up with a lot of gold, you're going to try to figure out what that means that you have gold. Well, how, like, what's the value here? What do I do with this? And I think where we were maybe 3 years ago, it wasn't so intuitive to understand what value and power could be in your data. People could explain it to you. It's not rocket science, right? Like, here's a very simple example. Look at a chart, with like two values, right? And you can like learn something. So it definitely, and our kids are doing it in school. So definitely, like, people understand it from a high level, but they don't necessarily understand how to action that value. So I think that was 3 years ago. Now people understand that that data is actionable because they continually see examples of that as true. And they see from their business analysts going on and on about, yeah, Snowflake and Databricks, these massive businesses, and everyone's building on it. You can do this with your data, you can do that. And it's become like, yeah, of course you could do all these things. Of course, you just hire some data analysts and data scientists and like whatever.
But
So like everyone's staffing up because, and I think this is like maybe it's a human thing, right? Yes, there's reward, but most of us are really more motivated, right, by avoidance of risk. So if I'm afraid I'm gonna miss the boat on something obvious, I don't want to be the next blockbuster story, right? That's nobody wants to be that. So everyone inherently knows that this is the tree that you should be barking up, but it's not necessarily so clear on how to bark up that tree. So I like to call this data Darwinism, right? Just because I think it's very like cerebral in that sense of like, yeah, there's a certain evolution that's happening. And you don't necessarily know as you live in this world of change. Data's changing. We talked about people changing, regulations are changing, that pursuit of technologies, of capabilities of taking data and do things with compute capabilities. What we can do that with GPUs, like we didn't know we could do that with GPUs before. Right. So as everything is constantly evolving, the real question is, how do you set yourself up to be evolving too? Because you can't know what you don't know. So all you can know is that things will change. So if you believe that your strategy enables you to adapt, then you're probably in a good place. Look for examples internally as to how you are adapting, situations where you successfully adapted, where you were about to do a migration project and recognized that if you don't go and understand that private, like for example, that privacy ramifications, you're going to move all this data to all these new places, and now you've totally lost down where everything is, and now you're going to have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to figure out all over again. And the risks are always there for data migration projects. To recognize that I must be adaptable is how I must think going forward. If I cannot think of myself as adaptable, it's going to be hard for me to think of myself as being there at all in the future.
Mhm.
Um, People talk about how unfortunately, like, there's a lot of turnover in the data community, and I think a lot of people talk about this in a lot of fields, just really anything where there's a lot of change happening. But again, if that change is happening and you know it's happening, you know it's going to continue to happening, it's going to continue to keep happening, then we need to find ways to look at each situation and say, what does this represent? What is this challenge representing? Is this one thing that I need to solve for today, or is this show that I am not able to adapt? Right? If states are popping up with new requirements for data privacy, and they're not all the same, and you're a growing business, and your legal team is not set up for like this kind of complexity, or maybe your legal team is, but your compliance team isn't. If they are, your data team isn't. The bit like sit down with everyone and figure out what do we need to get ahead. And yes, do talk to vendors, because AI's role in, we talked about the consumption use case, but AI's role in governing, AI's role in being able to move faster has been undisputable in terms of its value. Undisputable. Anybody who's trying to figure out like, oh gosh, I need to go shopping today, I don't know what to do, right? 5 minutes later, you got a full shopping list, and it was easier than ever before. And your brain is still available for other things because you can just do an impossible task that could not possibly be done. How am I going to make this list, right? It can help you. And vendors are constantly exploring this, and they're constantly learning from what they're trying with their, with their partners. And there's a lot of collaboration happening. I think that's one of the great things about the data field is there's so much collaboration. So lean into it, like when people pick up the phone and call you and say, hey, I wanted to talk about something, like, what is that about? What's the driver behind that business figuring out something and knowing to call people like you? What's going on there, right? So I think when certain market categories are still growing, there's a certain point where it's like, let's learn what we can do. So I think I also like encourage everyone, like, figure out what you're not yet able to do, which questions we talked about today that you can't really answer so well, you don't have so confidence, or maybe you recognize there's maybe some sort of like interdepartmental reason why that's true, or whatever kind of dynamic that is, right? Recognize that might be the thing that's going to keep us from being able to adapt. So again, that like arms race, the data Darwinism thing, right? Am I able to move fast? And if not, what what needs to change for that to happen? Who do I get on board?
I think that makes sense, David. And I think it is important how critical getting this right is. I mean, I think there are multiple like races underway, right, between countries around, and how do you allow the export of potentially data, but then also the foundation models. Do you want to be exporting your model that in a way that allows you to have more control globally, or do you want to not export that model because you only want to make it available for use within your own borders? We're having this conversation on the data side, on the foundation model side, but then also on hardware and GPUs, right? So restricting, for example, use of NVIDIA GPUs outside of the US borders as an example. And so then you have countries that are trying to get like control over their own AI destiny. So basically designing their own hardware, developing their own models, not allowing their data to be more freely accessible for consumption by other foundation model players outside of their borders. There's this whole thing underway. But that's also happening within industry. So companies like in insurance or in banking or whichever vertical, they're competing with one another. There is this trade-off, I think, between going slowly and being deliberate and maybe not being the first mover, but like learning how others in the space are doing it because it's a more cautious, more maybe risk averse manner. There are benefits with that. But then there's the flip side, which is if you're too risk averse, if you're too late in the game, too back of the pack, then the ones that are more risk taking, more front of the pack, might actually be too far ahead by the time you realize, right? And so I'm curious, David, on that front, as you think about industries that data Darwinism, maybe Darwinism generally speaking around AI, how do you think about um, which risks to take and how much risk taking should you be as an organization versus how much should you be kind of in a follower mindset where you kind of see things proven out a few times over before you really latch on and bring it within your organization?
Yeah, I would say it might be helpful to think of yourself as opposed to an enabler of the business, but to think of yourself as the business. Why? Because if your competitors had a business unit and you found out that they were staffing up and they were moving full speed ahead, you'd probably pick up your ears and think, what's going on over there? I must match that. They must see some opportunity and I must get involved with that. And you would put your people on it right away to understand what that means. And you would take action. You wouldn't not. I think it's time to think of of the enablers of the business as the same thing. Because if your competitors are going and finding ways to enable the business and they're staffing up and they're going to RFP on different projects, that's your cue that that it's happening. So I think it's not about waiting it out necessarily. It's about waiting for the right signals and not missing them. If the right signals come out, like think about just the amount of time it used to take for things to come to market, and for the things that came to market for businesses to actualize value from it. That has changed.
Mhm.
So using that, like crossing the chasm, like example, the bell curve of a market, where typically if you're a vendor and you're trying to sell something to a market, right? You have to start with the people like you just described, right? They don't know of the value yet. They haven't seen it proven out, and they kind of move to conservatives who are still waiting to see that like it proven over and over and over again. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying just do it the same thing faster. That's number one. And I think number two is you have to think of risk as not something you're going into, but something that is currently happening. And what I mean by that is it might feel like you're taking a risk to move away from your status quo to do something new. By definition, it is a risk, right? Because there's known and there's unknown. Unknown is unknown. But at the same time, if you're known is a broken factor, if your known is a liability, then you've already proven that risk today, in which case you to wait for something is itself a risky thing to do. And I think the dynamics between these two sides of any given market, and we've all seen it, right? We've seen it in families, we've seen it in communities, we've seen it at work, right? We've seen it in businesses. The way that these two groups interact with each other is often like they come at odds, right? I want to do this crazy thing. Like you do that crazy thing, it's going to kill us all, right? But now it's like, I want to do that crazy thing. And it's like, well, why? Prove it to me. I It's now my job to get you to explain to me why you think that crazy thing is actually worth doing. Because you might the fact that you are faster moving at things may not be necessarily good for my point of view. I can't lose that reality that you are noticing something in a world where people who don't notice things become irrelevant. So I think it's just the dynamics of change and how we relate to the change that happens in our world. And there's always going to be people who just can't change, and that's going to be tough for them and tough for others. It could also be an asset where if they're listening and they're asking the right questions, they can get the rest of the business to actually get clarity on what they want to do at all. So sometimes you actually, you're that decision maker, you have that chance to, or that influence, or you have that chance to say, no, that doesn't serve us the way you described it. Let's get better at this because I see everyone else is doing it. I'm not going to denounce it. I'm going to say, let's go deeper. Let's get more defined on this. If that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it does, and I really appreciate those perspectives, right? There's risk in staying with the status quo. It's a question of how much information do you need to um, take the risk of the status quo and move towards a new risk, which is the risk of unknown, but maybe it's relatively less unknown over time, which is maybe newer technologies like the use of AI, right? So I
Yeah.
think you have to kind of weigh the risks on both sides of staying where you are versus the risks of where you may, the kind of the journey that you have to take in order to get to the other side and the risks associated with that journey. And I think getting that timing right is really critical. Well, David, really appreciate all your perspectives here and your thoughts. Where could our audience find you and more about your company next?
Yeah, first of all, you can always hit me up on LinkedIn if you haven't noticed. I like chatting. Um, but I always also really do like hearing what other people are working on. I think the world of data is so fascinating right now. There's so much diversity in what's happening now. So I'm always up for conversation. I guess I'll shamelessly promote my own podcast too. We have the Secret Life of Data, and we use that also as a platform to kind of like learn from people and help people share their stories on how the human side of data is not just like a cliche, it's actually the whole thing, which I think has come up in this on our own conversation. But check out our website, blogs.ai. We have always making new materials and new videos to help people understand what's possible in the world of data governance, AI, data governance, data access governance, data governance of AI, any combination of any of these things that you're trying to do internally. We're talking about it, and we'd love to hear what you have to say so that we can continue the conversation.
Amazing, David. We'll make sure to include that in our show notes. And thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Shankar. It was great to be here.